right, getting started in a few minutes here. Thanks everyone for dropping by. We're going to talk about Hotwire Native today. We're going to walk through how to build an app. We're going to do some iOS, and do some Android. We'll just wait a few minutes to let everyone get started. To everyone pop in. You won't need anything on your machine. I'm going to be doing everything on mine. But if you want to follow along, I'd recommend waiting until the recording and then walking you through yourself. So, see a couple people in the chat. Looks like some folks are getting some echo. Let me see if that is a setting on my end. If you're getting an echo, let me know as well, so I can fix that for you. Let's see here. Same echoing. Cool. All right. Mic, audio. Okay, I think that should get rid of the echo. If that fixes it for y'all, let me know. Better. Okay, cool. Echo seems fixed. Sweet. I used to use StreamYard for streaming, which was like you set up like a simple thing and then it would like pop it to Twitter, to YouTube, all that stuff. And even with their Black Friday prices, they just like are a little out of my range and I couldn't get it to work in time. So we're using OBS, which is just like this archaic but super powerful way to stream stuff from multiple sources. And I'm pulling video from my phone because it has the best camera. I use my AirPods for audio. I'm streaming my screen, the second monitor setup. So like it's a lot right now, but that's okay because if you're seeing me and you're hearing me without any echo, that's all that matters. All right, I see a lot of friendly faces in the chat. David Miranda, it's good to see you. It's been a while. Marco, how's it going? Cool, lots of folks names I recognize in there too. We have already like 15 people that are here, so I think it's probably about a good time to get started. So here is how this is going to work. First, I'm going to give you an introduction on who I am, what we're going to do today. Then we're going to walk through building a Hotwire native app on iOS, and then we're going to do the same thing on Android, and then we're going to take some time to do some Q&A. Q&A will work through the chat, which you should see in YouTube. I'm seeing that on my screen here, so if you have a question, definitely just like pop it in the chat, and I'll be able to answer that as quickly as I can. So, first of all, who am I? I am Joe Maslotti. If you've seen this before, I'm the Hotwire native guy. I used to be the Turbo native guy, and then we did the rebrand. We're now a Hotwire native consultant. I help Rails developers build these web-powered iOS and Android apps with Hotwire native. I think I've launched like almost 30 of these in the App Store now, which is like just kind of insane. But I've been around the block a little bit. I know what I'm doing. I've done a lot of different work for different clients. But yeah, I love to do this free kind of content and stuff. And I'm also writing a book, Hotwire Native for Rails developers, which the beta will be available very, very soon. I'll have an update on that a little bit later. But let's dive in. So Hotwire Native, what is Hotwire Native? Hotwire Native is a web-first framework for building native mobile apps. What does that mean? It means that you can take your your Rails app, your existing functionality that exists on your Rails app, your features, your login, your authentication, and kind of shove it in a web view and have it show up on your Android and iOS devices that you can launch to the App Store. I love this little screen here where we're talking like native and web. I don't know if it shows the exact kind of like power of all of this, so we're going to walk through all of it so you can really see how this all works. So I have here a little kind of like a demo app, right? This is the hiking journal app that I've used in a lot of my other of these type demos. What it is a really simple way for you to add a hike. It's a kind of a CRUD-based app. You can upload an image, but for the most part, we're looking at a couple screens here. There's a map. that's rendered with, on the web. We have a little hamburger menu and stuff. There's not really much going on. It's not too exciting, but that's kind of the point, is that it's a standard Rails app with some extra stuff added on to work with Hotwire Native. So we're going to take this, this mobile app, if you look at it here for the mobile web, and we're going to make it into a Hotwire Native app for both iOS and Android. Okay? So first thing we're going to do is we're going to open Xcode. When you open Xcode for the first time, it's probably going to look like this. You can hit create new project here, but the second time you open it, it's not going to show you something like this. So what I like to do is do it through File, New Project, just so we know where it exists if we don't see this welcome screen. We're going to create an iOS app and hit Next. A lot of these other things are stuff we won't get into, Mac OS apps, TV, watch, also creating frameworks and stuff. For the product name, we're just going to call it Demo. And team here, it might say add a team for you, but we don't need to worry about that because we're not deploying this. Organization identifier. This is the bundle identifier. I like to use reverse domain name. So my domain is mazzolati.com, so I do com.mazzolati. It's a way to uniquely identify this in the App Store. It's a way to uniquely identify your apps. It won't matter too much for this demo. You just have to have something in there. The important choices are that we want to use Storyboard and not SwiftUI. We can add SwiftUI elements to our Hotwire Native app, but we do not build the app with SwiftUI. We build it with UIKit, which is what Storyboard means here. We're definitely going to want to use Swift. We don't have any testing for this one, and we're not going to use any core data storage, so we can't check host in cloud. We click Next. I'm going to toss this right onto my, my desktop here and hit Create. What that will give us is kind of like this baseline, bare bones, just blank iOS app. I don't even think it shows anything on the screen here. Let's see what we got here. First time you launch the simulator, it takes a few minutes to get going. And we get a beautiful white screen. So it's working, but as is with these templates, it's essentially an empty template, right? So there's nothing going on here. So I'm going to close out of this. What we're going to do is work mostly in this file called scene delegate. I double click it to open it, and we're going to delete all this code, so don't worry about it just yet. Before we do that, we're going to add Hotwire Native as a package dependency. So File, Add Package Dependencies. Think of this as like bundler for Swift. It's the Swift Package Manager is what it uses. You can point to any URL as long as it has a package.swift file. It knows how to add it to your app, which is pretty sweet. So here we're hosting the Hotwire Native iOS GitHub repo, because you can see here there's the package.swift. And this tells all these interesting stuff that we need to know, where the files are located and all that good stuff. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to copy and paste here from the browser and paste it in right there. And we get this README filled out for us. We're going to work up to the next major version and then hit Add Package. Here it's saying, where do you want to add this package to? We're going to link it to our demo app, make sure that's selected, and then hit Add Package. You'll see now that we have this package dependencies over in our Project Explorer on the left. Clicking this arrow is kind of like doing bundle open. We can now see all the source code of the Hotwire Native codebase, which is pretty cool. There's the README that we looked at earlier. Let's close that out for now and pop back open our scene delegate, the launching point of our application. When an app launches on iOS, it calls this scene will connect to options function. We don't use any of these parameters. We're going to just use it as kind of like the kicking off point or the jumpstart point to getting our Turbo or Hotwire Native app working. So we're going to delete the comments. I don't care about them. Delete these empty lines. And then we don't need any of these functions, so they're all gone too. We're left with this single function with this guard statement. Without going into too much detail, this guard statement essentially just makes sure that we have something to work with to actually attach things to the screen, so we're going to leave it there. We're going to import Hotwire Native at the top. Unlike Ruby, unlike Rails, unlike more a dynamic language, we need to actually import our specific libraries to use them. Once we have our Hotwire native, we can create a private variable called navigator. A navigator is something that lets us navigate between screens. We give it a root URL and it manages our stack of navigation controllers. It presents things modally. It deals with all of the transitions and animations and everything. It's the high-level wrapper that Hotwire Native introduced on top of Turbo iOS and makes for a much, much easier, integration. Down here, after our guard statement, we're going to grab our window. The window is what you see on the screen. I just updated my operating system, and I think that it added Apple Intelligence. So this line of code is actually exactly what we want to write. So we're just going to hit tab there. But what's going on here is that we're saying, grab the window, which is what you see on the screen. Every app has one window. Set the root view controller. The root view controller is the core controller that manages all of the views in the app. On Rails, we have views and controllers. On iOS, we have view controllers. It's kind of like everything bundled together. It manages the view and also some of the logic. And we're going to assign it to the root view controller from our navigator. This essentially says, okay, pass all control over to the Hotwire native navigator. Let that handle everything. From there, we're going to call navigator.route, and we're going to route a root URL. This root URL is going to be the root URL of our application, of our code base, right? So we're going to route here, localhost 3000. I'm throwing an explanation point at the end to force unwrap this. Swift deals with optional in a very strict way, and by passing an arbitrary string into this URL initializer, it might not be valid. We're telling it, hey, it is valid, so trust us. And that's why we're force unwrapping it there. If this was an invalid URL, the app would crash when it got to this line. But I'm okay with that because this is a statically typed string, so I'm okay with essentially trusting us. Next, I'll hit run. Clicking run will launch the app back in that simulator. The first time we launch a Hotwire native app in the simulator, it takes a good 5 to 10 seconds to launch. That doesn't happen on subsequent launches. I'll show you that by stopping it and clicking run one more time. You'll see that it launches immediately. I don't know why that is, but it's just the way that it is, and it only happens in the simulator, not on a real device. So we now are seeing our home screen. We have our hikes laid out. We have a couple of things are hidden and not being shown. That's because of the user agent matching, but we can now navigate around our app. We can click screens, we can push screens. We're not getting anything with modals just yet. You'll see that everything is getting pushed onto the side, but we have a practically full functioning iOS app with Hotwire native in 1, 2, 3, I think it's 5 lines of code, 5 lines of additional code. We actually deleted more code than we added to get this working. Pretty freaking awesome, if I do say so myself. This was one of the main goals with Hotwire native, was to make this onboarding experience that much easier. This will get you so far with wrapping your Rails app. It's kind of wild how so few lines of code can get you to a point where, like, you could almost deploy this to folks. It wouldn't be perfect, but like you could deploy this in a way that said, this is our beta, we're going to continue working on it, and you have a really awesome functioning app here. If I were to continue down this path and not move on to Android, I would talk about the path configuration. I would definitely want this sign-in screen, this form, to be presented as a modal, to kind of like slide up from the bottom. Kind of like how the Contacts app works. When I click the plus sign, we get this new contact sliding up from the bottom. We're not going to talk about that today, but I will definitely be coming back to that in future videos as we talk about the path configuration. That's where we configure stuff like that. You can read more about that at native.hotwire.com. If you go to iOS and then path configuration, this is an overview of how you could add that to your app on your own without following along with the video that I just talked about. So that does it for iOS. It's really quick. It's really easy. That was the main goal of Hotwire Native. I love how simple this is. I love how powerful this is. I'm going to move on to Android next, which, spoiler alert, requires a little bit more code. So I have Android Studio popped up. I'm going to close out of Xcode and close out of that as well. Close out of that. So same thing with Android Studio. Marco is asking why, is there a reason why the modal couldn't be launched based on a meta tag that you control from the server? So we don't use meta tags because the meta tag would have to appear on the page that's presented, and that would be too late. We need to know if the screen should be presented modally when we click the button. So before we load the actual page that we want presented as a modal. That's where the path configuration comes into place, where we can say, hey, all URLs that end in /new, present them as a modal. Then we don't have to load the next page to read that meta tag. We can present that modal before we start loading that page, which is really the only like order of operations that would work. We've experimented with adding like data tags and stuff, but we haven't gotten far with implementing that in Hotwire Native yet. So path configuration really is the way to go. Let me know if that didn't clarify for you. I guess before we move on to Android, are there any more questions on iOS that I could answer really quick before we dive into Android? I'll wait a few seconds here to see if anything pops up. Awesome. Glad that made sense, Marco. Cool. Okay. One more second. Assuming no one has any questions on the Xcode, the iOS side of stuff, we're going to move on to Android now. So same thing as iOS, same thing as Xcode. We have this welcome screen. You click new project. File new project is how I like to create an Android project. Again, because it will always be there. Sometimes Android Studio launches like this. That actually closed Android Studio. So let's do file new project. We have a question. Surely no questions for iOS. I would like to know how to implement tabs later. Yeah, we can talk about tabs after we do Android for sure. That's going to be more than just one or two sentences, and I can walk you through some pseudocode there. So for Android, what we're going to do here is we're going to create a empty views activity. Empty views activity gives us a nice balance of we don't have to delete as much code as if we did empty no activity. But if we do empty activity, we get Jetpack Compose app, which is like Swift UI, and we don't want that to start. We actually want to continue to use like traditional fragments and stuff, just like we use view controllers in iOS. This looks great. Like okay, so it's naming our application my application. We named it demo on iOS. Doesn't really matter here. We're going to call it my application so we don't have the conflicts. It's located in the same directory on our desktop. Package name, same thing we talked about with bundle name on iOS. Here's where we're going to save it. Language, we definitely want to use Kotlin. I wouldn't know how to do this with Java. Minimum SDK. So this is saying which Android API do you want to allow users to support, right? This is always updating with every new version of Android Studio. I'm fine with anything around 90%. If you don't think that's high enough, you can drop this to 27 Oreo. That would be 93.9. However, you couldn't use Hotwire Native. Hotwire Native requires 28 or higher because of some configuration settings that are going on under the hood. I like this balance. If you have different requirements, or you can even bump it higher, you'll have access to different, you'll have less devices, but more features available to you. We also want to make sure we use the Kotlin DSL instead of the Groovy DSL. We'll talk about what that even means with the build.gradle when we get to that file. Okay, I'm going to click finish, and Android Studio is going to do a bunch of stuff for us, and the screen's going to kind of go crazy for a few seconds as it syncs Gradle. As it what? Gradle is the way that our project is kind of managed. It downloads dependencies, it configures our IDE, it can do all these crazy like plugin things, and you'll even notice how all of this yellow stuff on the left, once Gradle finishes syncing, will get collapsed into something that's much more manageable to deal with. There we go. Now Gradle, now the IDE, Android Studio, knows that this is an Android project, so it switches us to the Android view. The Android view separates us into a much more manageable way of finding our stuff that we need. First thing we want to do, though, is actually add the Hotwire Native package, I think is what, yeah, the package, the dependency, right? So we're going to open up Gradle scripts here, and we're going to open the second one, the second build.gradle.kts. This is the app module level, not the project level, but the app level Gradle file. This is like the configuration for everything. It tells us what SDK to compile to. It tells our package name. If we have any tests, what runner to use. It also can configure build types and all that fun stuff. But down here we have our dependencies. Here, right above test, we're going to add an implementation for dev.hotwire.core, and I know that we are on version 1.0.1. We're also going to do the same for dev, hotwire, and then navigation fragments. These are the two libraries that are needed to get Hotwire Native working. The first one is all about, the second one is about navigation between screens and uses fragments. The first one is the core of the library. It's where Turbo exists. It's where the JavaScript exists, Strata, Bridge components. In the future, this second one might get removed in favor of a more Jetpack Compose declarative UI framework type approach. But for now, this is all we have, so we'll use that. Once we're good, we click Sync Now. We changed our Gradle file, so we're going to sync. This is going to download our package. You can see it kind of running across the bottom. It'll take a lot longer the first time you do it. I already have it cached from building these apps a bunch, so it was pretty quick. Done with that file for now. We can open up the manifest. The Android manifest declares information about the application. It lets you know what your activity is, which screen to launch to when the app starts, what API you want to target, what version. It also allows us to add specific permissions to the app. Our app wouldn't be much if it didn't have access to the internet. So we're going to want to add that Android internet permission there. That tells the app itself that it can access the internet, of course, but more importantly, or not more importantly, less importantly, when you download this app from Google Play, there'll be a big category on like, these are the permissions this uses, and internet will be listed there, along with probably 95% of all the other apps that exist on the Google Play Store. Okay, that's our manifest file. Up next, we're going to want to open our layout file. So Android uses XML to lay out screens. We don't have to worry about it after we configure this single screen, but we do need to get in here and make sure that we can have Hotwire Native find the screen to attach the web view to. When you launch it for the first time, it might look like this, which is kind of more the visual editor of this hello world. I only run the app right now, so we can actually see how this reflects. Spoiler alert, that's what we're going to build. It is not what's actually happening. That was a different app. So you see down here, Gradle build running, and we're having an issue with the Android SDK. This is something that had just popped up recently as I updated to the latest version of Android. I'm not really sure why, but it's forcing us to bump target SDK to 35. So let's try that again and then run the app. And it's, oops. Okay, so no inspection there. Let's try one more time. Okay, dependency, Android core requires libraries not to depend on its 35 or later. Oh, whoops. I changed the wrong one. We don't want to change target SDK. We want to change compile SDK. This says, what are we compiling the code with? What are we making the bundle with? Versus what do we allow our users to use? So compiling versus targeting. Compiling means that we can use like fun, new syntactic sugar in our code. But target is more of like the new features that come out because a device might not support that new feature yet. So bumping this is usually pretty safe. Bumping this requires a little bit more thought as you build your apps. So this is what we have. Hello world. Hooray. Where's that coming from? Activity main. You can see our hello world little text field there. I'm going to switch over to the code view. And you can see that we have something called a constraint layout, which fills the width and height of the screen. And then inside we have a little text view that says, hello world. So that's where this is coming from. This activity main XML file is getting pulled from this main activity file, which we'll touch on in a few minutes. But for now, we want to get rid of all this. We don't want to show the text view to the world, right? We want to show an Android X fragment app fragment container view. This is essentially a view that can hold a fragment inside. A fragment is like a view controller on iOS. A view controller is like a view plus controller in Rails. So it's a way of encapsulating our screen into one, our logic into like one screen. We'll have both of these match parent to fill the width of the screen and the height of the screen. We also here need to do an XLMNS Android and give it the Android package, and then XL app. These essentially say what is the schema that we're using to make sure when we reference a leading keyword, where to find that. So here we say Android, and here we say Android. That tells Android Studio, like, okay, this value is part of the Android schema. We'll do also one where we have app : default nav host equals false. And this one is the app prefix, so it's part of this schema. And you can click either of these. Well, schemas that I thought you could. It's not working. I thought that these were actually publicly available, but they might be referenced internally, and that's just their like namespace name. I'll have to look into that. I'll come back to that one. We need two more. We need to give this an ID. And we're going to call this the main nav host, not the man nav host, the main nav host. And then the last one is that we're going to give it a name. And this will be the dev, Hotwire, navigation, navigator host. So giving it an ID allows us to reference it in the future. Giving it a name is saying, remember, this is a fragment container view. The name is the name of the fragment, this fully qualified namespaced fragment that we want to host inside of this view. And this, as you can see here, is part of the Hotwire package. This is equivalent to Navigator on iOS. Alrighty, back now, let's open main activity. This is similar to Scene Delegate on iOS. So we're going to do something very similar. We're going to delete most of the stuff here and just have this like super on create. We don't need that one. Instead of inheriting from app compat activity, we're going to inherit from Hotwire activity. And one of the cool things about Android Studio is if you do I'll show you up here. I have my import statements, right? We don't need these anymore. If I import from Hotwire activity and hit enter, you'll notice that this one was added for us. It will import everything we need as we kind of type it, which is pretty cool. These red lines are complaining that we haven't implemented the functions that we need. We'll get to that in a sec. In onCreate, that is the launch of the activity. When this activity appears on the screen, when it's created, what do we want to do? We want to set the content view to our layouts activity main. Remember when we set that ID earlier? Activity main is coming from our res layout activity main XML file. So it's saying, okay, this screen relates to this XML file. Okay. Last thing we have to do for Android in this file is our main activity. Let's see if I can show that error. All this is saying is that if you have to implement this function called navigator configurations. So let's implement that function called navigator configurations, right? This creates a list of navigator configurations. We didn't have to do this on iOS because we manage the navigators ourselves. Android manages our list, our navigators for us to inflate views and screens and all that good stuff. So we're just going to give it a navigator configuration here. We're going to call it main as a name. This is arbitrary. It can be anything. It just has to be distinct. Our start location is going to be our root URL from earlier. We'll talk about, we'll pull that out in a sec. And our navigator host ID is R, which is our references to our resources, .id main nav host. And if you remember from earlier, that's what we set right here. So this is telling Hotwire Native, for this navigator, attach to this fragment container view. Populate this fragment container view in your app. We'll grab that root URL, not let, that's Swift. Val root URL equals HTTP local host 3000. Okay. And we're going to run this now and see what happens. While we have an error loading that page, which was expected, Marco asked, where is R coming from? R is this generated resource thing in Android. All of your under res for resources, all of these have generated statically typed namespaced references to them. So here we can also do something like r.colors. And here are all the colors that we've, both of the colors that we've defined in our app in this colors file, black and white. We could do r.layout like we talked about above and grab our activity main. We could even do r.drawable, and these are our launcher icons. Those exist right here. So it's this really cool way of just like statically referencing all of your resources without having to worry about magic strings and stuff like that. I really like that part of Android. Okay, so we have an error loading page. What's going on here is we have a problem, but let's see if we can actually see. Logcat down here is how we see our logs in Android. I'm going to scroll up to where that big chunk of red was. And we're going to see that we have a Java runtime exception stating that this activity, no, wait, that's not the error I was expecting. Let's take it one step at a time. Let's not hit our local host just yet. Let's hit the Hotwire Native demo really quick to see if that can get us working. I think that I may have poked something by accident somewhere. All right, what's going on here? So, failed execution tech, parse, debug local resources, activity main 2. Did I may have copy pasted this by accident. Show in Finder. Reveal in Finder? Open in Finder. No, just one XML file. IntelliJ. So I've never seen this before. I can't tell if it's a problem with the code that we wrote or if it's a problem with the IDE. Parse library. So what we're going to do here is just close out Android Studio. I'm going to try again. And we're going to try it one more time. So we're Gradle build running. It's a good start. Oh, same thing. Failed file name validation. Activity main underscore 2 makes me think that it's like copy and pasted this activity main file, but I don't know where or why, which is very odd. We're now pointing to the Hotwire Native demo directly. So what I was going to show you where we can't access HTTP, we need to access HTTPS and allow for that is something that I was going to get to. A string in the error message, it was Park complaining about a blank string with blank spaces. Let's clean the project. Try again. So I just did help clean or build clean project. Yay, Android Studio. No wonder I've never seen that issue before. Okay, so I punched in the Hotwire Native demo URL, which is why we're seeing this page right now, just to prove that we could get it working. We don't care about that though. We want to hit our actual local server, right? So if we do localhost here, and then we do root URL, and then we run the app, we're going to see the error that I thought or I was expecting us to see. Error loading page is what I wanted to see. Error loading page because a very cryptic way of saying that a late init property navigator has not been initialized. I don't know what the hell that means. It's extremely confusing, but we're going to prove what it means by doing this. If I open Chrome and I type in HTTP http://localhost 3000, a site cannot be reached. This is because Android, on the simulator, on iOS, it routes localhost back to the machine that it's being run from. On Android, localhost means the device itself, which doesn't actually run our server. So on Android, we have to use this weird thing called 1.0.2.2. 1.0.2.2, is that right? Android local IP. Googling. 10.10. Even weirder. 10.0.2.2, port 3000. There is our local host from our actual application. Sorry, from our MacBook. So we can't type in localhost. We had to type in 10.0.2.2. Okay? And when we run it, we are still sadly going to see an error. This now is because we're accessing something from HTTP, and Android does not allow access to HTTP. So we're going to open up our Android manifest one time, and we're going to type in here, Android uses clear text traffic and set it to true. This is telling Android that allow access to non-SSL endpoints, in our case, HTTP. And when we run this, we finally will see our app launch with Hotwire Native working. So, a couple more steps on Android. Let's walk through those in order. The first thing that we did was we added our dependencies down to the module app level build.gradle configuration, 1.0.1 for core and navigation fragments. We then opened up our manifest. We allowed internet permission, and we also allowed clear text traffic. So this is allow internet. This is allowed for HTTP with no S. We opened up our activity main, our main layout of the app, and we set it to a fragment container for our navigator host. And then finally, in our main activity, we gave it the URL. We set the content view to match our activity main layout, and we configured a navigator, one instance of a navigator pointing to our root URL and pointing the host ID back to that ID that we gave in the activity main right there. Cool thing in Android Studio, command click, just like in Xcode, will point to where we are. So that's pretty cool. You can see on the right, it's like highlighting that. And we have it working. Same problems that we talked about earlier, like I want sign in to come up from the bottom. That would be path configuration. We're not going to get into that right now, but with a little bit of debugging, which we dug into Logcat a little bit, that is Android as well. It's way more lines of code, a little bit of configuration, a little bit more finicky. But the good news is, just like the one on iOS, is if you wanted to follow along, there's the Android Getting Started guide, which pretty much walks you through everything that I just did, with the exception of it just says to copy and paste and doesn't explain the stuff. And it only works on the native Hotwire Native demo. If you follow this instructions on your own, do not forget to do clear text traffic, and do not forget that you have to do 10.022 instead of localhost. Android development, it's wild. Okay, I missed a couple questions here. Is the error message part complaining about a blank string? Yeah, no idea where that was going on. And yeah, Matthew recommended the clear text traffic for localhost. That's exactly right. I was trying to get there a little more organically, but we got it. We made it work. So that's Hotwire Native on iOS and Android. Again, I just really worked through the 2 getting started guides for both platforms. You're welcome to follow along. I recommend you doing that on your machine and working through all of that to make sure that you can follow through. But we still have some time left in this session. So before we transition to Q&A, if you need help with your Hotwire Native app, I have 2 resources for you. I have a blog and a newsletter that talk about Hotwire Native every week or so. The newsletter is a little bit less frequent as I write the book. And if you need help with your company or you need some training and stuff, I also offer some consulting where I offer building the app for you, workshops, retainers, and then a pairing session, which you can kind of just book right through here. So that's my pitch. The rest of the time is yours, so to speak. If anyone has any questions, drop them in the chat, and I will answer as many as I can as we walk through the rest of this live stream. We had a question earlier. Hey, Alessandro, how's it going? We had a question earlier about tabs. I see tabs on Android coming in as well. So we'll definitely touch on tabs a little bit. Can I like highlight this? No. We're going to get to tabs. I'm going to answer the quick ones first. Have I ever encountered problems with the App Store because most of the app is like a web view? I have never been rejected for a Hotwire or Turbo Native app in the past because it was a web view. I've been rejected for other reasons. But you do need to make sure you have at least one fully native feature in your app. So I have an article on see if I can find it. App Store submission tips for Hotwire native apps. And this talks through all of the stuff that you want to highlight. Minimum functionality is the problem. Your app should include features, content, and UI that elevate it beyond a repackaged website. If your Hotwire native app is only a repackaged website, you will probably get rejected. So I always make sure with my clients and personal apps that I do that there is at least one native feature. As you can read here, I usually reach for a native tab bar, or I reach for something like a native menu. Push notifications are another great one. Yes, those exist on the web, but you can make a push, pardon my pun, for the fact that they're more reliable on a native device. And because of that, I've never been rejected personally for 4.2. I've been rejected for like business reasons and in-app purchases and stuff, but if you follow along that and have at least one native feature, you should be good. Release date for the book is 2025. That's as much as I can say right now. There is a beta coming very soon. I can almost say when the beta is coming, but not yet. The beta will include the first, I'll show you here, the first, I think, 6 chapters. Yeah, the first 6 chapters. It's in tech review right now. I'm hoping to know very soon when that beta is and when I can talk about it, but I will announce that first on my newsletter, but soon. How is it using Jetpack? This is for Matthew again. How is it using Jetpack Compose? I'm reasonably confident putting together something with the traditional Android approach. I was lost trying to get Hotwire Native working with Jetpack. Yeah, don't use Jetpack Compose. Just like I'm not using Swift UI for the core of the app, don't use Jetpack Compose for the core of the app on Android. I didn't realize how far ahead I am of everyone. I apologize if the back and forth is off. Jetpack Compose works great for individual screens. It doesn't work really well for the core of the app. So you can continue to use traditional Android, and then when you want to use a Jetpack Compose screen, you can use a Compose view, capital C, capital V, and shove some Compose in there. My book talks about how to do that with a map. There's a map view that we create that's all built with Jetpack Compose, and it uses the traditional fragment way, and then uses a what's it called under the hood? A Compose view under the hood. From Robin here, now that I've managed to get Hotwire Native out, do I have any upcoming plans for native? I have the book. The book is definitely my biggest priority right now. The book is eating a lot of my time, most of my time. That should be out, at least in beta, very soon, like I mentioned. After that, I have some ideas for a component library and a cookbook of sorts for Hotwire Native. The component library being like, I need access to the user's location. Boom, here's the stimulus controller, the iOS bridge component, and the Android bridge component, and you can just copy paste those into your code base. And another one is kind of like a cookbook of sorts where it's like, okay, I need tabs. And here's all the code you need to build tabs on iOS, Android, and Rails. That would definitely be after the book, so that's like still on a 6-month timeline or so. But when that happens, I'm really excited because I'd love to hear what folks think about like what type of stuff you'd want to hear. Okay. Sorry about that, Matthew. Yeah, again, like this is not. If you have questions like that, just shoot me an email. Like I'm more than happy to answer. I'm joe@mazzolati.com. It's all over my website. Please just shoot me an email. I'd love to help you make those decisions before you spend that time. And if you want to pair for like 90 minutes, I also offer a paid, you can just book it through SavvyCal right on my website and start pairing with me like in 2 days or something for 90 minutes. So if you have questions like that, just like definitely hop on. Okay, I've delayed long enough. We want to talk about tabs. We want to talk about tabs on iOS. We want to talk about tabs on Android. I don't think I'll have time to get to both of them, but we can talk about tabs on iOS for now, and then we will see if I have time for Android. There I go. So for tabs on iOS, because I think it is a little bit easier to just talk about the idea and the concept. I have this article from back in August of last year. So this is over a year old, and it also deals with Turbo Native. So it's not like super, it's relevant, but it's not actually applicable. But the way that this works is that we have, a lot of it is though, we have a tab bar controller. We set the window root view controller to that, and then we add these tabs with a turbo navigation controller, which is something that already kind of exists in Hotwire Native, right? So we don't really need all of this. And then we're kind of building out these 3 tabs. So on iOS now, instead of having multiple instances of these controllers, we're going to have multiple instances of navigators. Right? Instead of having, we're going to have a tab bar controller. And instead of setting the root view controller to the navigator's root view controller, we're going to set it to the tab bar controller. That will give us, if I run this, a totally empty screen, but it will have a tab bar, or it should. I think the tabs are transparent, so we can't actually see them. We want to grab the tab bar controller and grab it, set its view controllers equal to our navigators, and we're going to map our navigators and return the navigator.root view controller. This essentially says set the tab bar controllers tabs, which are just called view controllers here, to the navigator's root one, just like we did before, but multiple of them. From here, we're going to say we're going to route a URL. So this is like not the best way. I'm hard coding a lot of stuff here, but it is a way to just get it working. I think you can make it work better on your own. We can do hikes, and we can do hikers or users, and we're just going to use 2 for now. And we're going to route URLs index. That's the right order? No. Okay, come on. So we have an array of URLs. You know, I can't leave you with this code. This is just not good enough. We're going to do URLs. Okay, so we have now a way of dynamic array of URLs. We're going to use those to map over and add, we don't actually need this anymore, that, and then route that URL by creating a new navigator. That navigator becomes the root view controller for that tab. Make sure our server is running. And I can't tell if it's frozen or if it's not working. Let's run it one more time and see if I'd set a breakpoint over here to see if we're actually getting in this. We are. Let's see how many we have. 2. Oh, okay. So these navigators are these are dropping out of memory. No one's holding on to these navigators, so they are actually just floating off and being memory collected. So we do need a variable array of navigators, even if it is empty to start, and then we'll kind of like shove it in there. That way that the scene delegate can hold on to a reference of those navigators and they won't fall out of memory. And now we actually have that working. So we have our first tab over here pointing to hikes, and we have our second tab here pointing to hikers, which is just another kind of endpoint on our server. This is a very, very, very bare bones way of getting hike tabs working on iOS. You'd obviously want to set like the UI tab bar item to make sure that we actually can see an icon and stuff. You also probably don't want to route them on the app launch. If you have 5 tabs, that's 5 hits to your server right away. So you'd want to deal with the scene delegate, a UI tab bar delegate, UI tab bar controller delegate, and this has a did select. There is where that's when the user changes the tab. You could wire that up. That's one way to do it. I cover this in my book pretty extensively, not to pitch that anymore, but like this is going to get you there. And with some tweaking, you can make it work to a point where it's like actually good for production. Android, Android's gonna be tough. So let's see here. On Android, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to do this in 3 minutes, but we're gonna try. Essentially, we want to do 2 things. We want to have multiple copies of the fragment container view. And then outside of that, we want to have a flipper. Is it flipper? Let's Google here. Android flipper view. View flipper, of course. So there's a thing called view flipper. And view flipper. Geeks for geeks. I'm sure this website will be great. Where's activity main? Okay, so it's a relative layout with a view flipper. Okay, cool. So we have a relative layout. There we go. Match parent. And then we have this thing called a view flipper. And then inside of the view flipper, we have our 2 fragment container views. What are you complaining about here? Let's get this into there and that into there as well. We always want those at top level. Okay. Yeah, I don't know why it added those if it was wrong. Okay, only red we have now is that we have 2 fragment container views, one for each tab, right, with the same ID. So we want to do hikes, nav host, and hikers, right? That's the first thing we want to do. The second thing we want to do is in our main activity, we now have like the same problem, right? We need to have our val of URLs equals a list of root URL plus hikes and root URL plus hikers. Oh, nice. Thanks, Android Studio. We're still going to set the same content, but we now need 2 navigator configurations. We now need one for the hikes and the hikers. And then we can't have them named the same thing. So we're going to name those hikes and hikers. Also the root URL. I guess we don't really need the URL array in this one, which is kind of interesting. So we'll do root URL slash hikes. And hikers. Now, when I run this, I'm not going to guarantee this works, but let's see how far it gets us and see if we can, I can just like talk about what would be next. Well, we definitely need a tab bar. So let's add that tab bar. It looks like this really quick tutorial is just kind of like adding these two buttons at the bottom. We would want to use a bottom navigation view in Android. The bottom navigation view, we can add it here. And we want the height to wrap content, and we want to then constrain it. So if I do match parent here as well, we're just going to have a screen that has conflicting constraints because everything is matching parent essentially here. Now all we're seeing is the actual tabs. So menu, bottom nav menu. This needs its whole new resource directory for menu. And this then needs a menu resource file for tabs. Sorry, this is probably pretty boring because I haven't done this 1,000 times like I have on iOS. Why can't, oh, it's there. Tabs. Okay, so we would add, can I do it through the editor? A menu item? Huh, nice. So the last thing we have to do is constrain all of this. We essentially have to say like this only goes to the bottom of the screen. This only covers a little bit of the screen. I forgot exactly how all the constraints work, but we're going to just try to do it anyway. So view flipper, Android constrain, align bottom to tabs. Unknown width. All right. I think this might have been the end of what I can do on a live stream. Okay, so we've now aligned the bottom of that to the tabs. We want to align the top of this to the flipper. Let's just give that a run, see what happens. Not crashing. But Okay, so this here, for those also watching like the recording of this is essentially like the layout of how you want your activity main to look. You have this relative layout. This actually should be a constraint layout, not a relative layout. I think that actually might be. Yeah, and then we get the missing constraints here because this thing, what constraint is missing? Not vertically constrained. Top. Once all of this lines out, this is not Hotwire Native, right? This is like building a tab bar. It's the same structure. The missing piece that I feel that folks miss with Hotwire Native though is you need two of these fragment container views wrapped in your view flipper. All of this code that I was writing here is not Android Hotwire Native specific. Only this is. And then in your main activity, having two navigator configurations. Once you have that, you can follow any old Android tutorial. I mean, this one on Geeks for Geeks, sure. But more importantly, like there's an Android, from Google, Android tabs tutorial, where if you walk through Android developers, right, like with View Pager, there's also one for this thing called View Flipper. So hopefully that answered your question, like where to get started. Again, like I wasn't planning on talking about this today, so I don't have everything prepared. All of this is in the book. It's just not something that I can do off the top of my head. So hopefully that was helpful. Okay, bunch more questions. I missed all this. Sorry. Theoretically, it should be possible to roll an Android solution using a combination of fragments, View Pager, and Fragment Pager adapter. The real work would be wiring it to work with Hotwire Navigator. Same thing here. All of this view stuff could be done with a View Pager and Fragment Pager adapter. Yeah, definitely. You'd want that if you want interaction between when the tabs change colors or sorry, get switched, all that stuff. So yeah, that would totally work. This is just a different approach there. Is Hotwire Native for Flutter a possibility in the future? I don't see us building a Flutter wrapper or anything in the future, but because I know that the team at Basecamp doesn't use Flutter at all. I don't use Flutter either, so you'd have to make a pretty good case for it. But if you wanted to create your own and wrap these libraries, you're more than welcome to. I'm just catching up on the Flutter stuff. Yeah, I know that someone was trying to create a turbo native React Native adapter. So you could essentially have turbo native views inside of your React Native app and kind of get the best of both worlds. I don't do React Native either, so I can't comment on how that worked out for them or if it was even like technically possible. But if you look at Hotwire Native as only managing your web views, you could wrap the rest of it in whatever framework or code base you wanted, quote, in theory, right? It's just not something that I have interest in because I do the things fully natively, and that's just how I work. Yeah, if you play with it, let me know. I'm happy to share, with my audience as well if you do find something that works. Folks are heading out. I got to head out too. I ran 10 minutes over. Thank you everyone for coming. Again, if you need help with any of this stuff in the future, just pop over to my website. My email address is right there. I'm on Twitter as well. And if you do anything today, it's to please subscribe to my newsletter. That is where I announce all of this stuff first. And the next email that goes out to this newsletter will most likely be an announcement of when you can buy the book and how. So I will leave you with that. Thank you again for everyone for coming. Definitely send me an email if you have questions as well. I'll talk to everyone.